So, Carl Honoré is an award-winning journalist, author, and TED speaker. In addition to articles published in The Economist, Miami Herald, and the Houston Chronicle, he's written two other books, including The Slow Fix, and the one we're talking about is In Praise of Slow. And I think the US version is In Praise of Slowness, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken, right? so,
That's right.
yeah, I was like, oh, okay, they've got two versions of this. But I actually wanted to ask you first and foremost is have you mastered balancing your hobbies with your work and your personal and family life yourself now?
Spoiler alert, yes, I have. uh, I mean, I didn't get there overnight. I mean, this is one of the ironies of our fast forward impatient culture is that we hear about slow and think, yeah, I want that, but I want it by tomorrow morning. I want to have the inner calm and the Dalai Lama by tomorrow afternoon, but it doesn't work that way. It's a process. So it took me time to get there, but yeah, no, I do now. I honestly, I can genuinely tell you that I do not feel rushed really anymore at all. I mean, I still have what on the outside to many people would look like a busy, and it is in a sense busy life, but it doesn't feel hurried. I don't feel hurried. I feel I've got I found that equilibrium point that works for me. Definitely.
I'm so
I found my
jealous.
inner Taurus.
That's amazing. I'm so jealous of that right now.
Mhm.
Yeah. Actually, so would you say then, are we winning or losing against the cult of speed?
We are winning. Yeah, I think we're both. It's a mixed picture. I think that the dominant keynote of modern culture remains acceleration, and that the taboo against slowness still runs very deep in the culture. But at the same time, the counter current for slowing down has grown in leaps and bounds. And I've just been blown away by how far and wide the slow movement reaches now in every walk of life, from slow food, slow sex, slow education, slow travel, slow fashion, slow work, slow technology, slow architecture. Any field of human endeavor, people are now bringing the lens of slow to the party and saying, how can I do this thing better by slowing down, by embracing this slow mindset? So I see it growing all over the place. In fact, I'll give you a data point from just this week. Indeed, the Google looked at all of the downloads and views for videos on YouTube in the last year, and videos with the title "Slow Living" in them, the views for those went up 400%, which I think says a lot about two things. One, that the trend for people embracing slow was already on the uptick, but that the pandemic has, I don't want to say accelerated that trend, but I would say deepened and strengthened it, right?
Yeah.
Given it more flesh and more meat and more meaning, because the pandemic has been a global workshop in slowness. A lot of bad slow. I don't welcome. A lot of people said, you must be so happy with the pandemic. It slowed every. I'm not. The pandemic is a total nightmare. I want it to end, and it's awful. But I do think, I do believe in silver linings. And I think a lot of people have experienced this last year as a moment of reset,
Mm.
reboot, and reconnection with slower rhythms. And a lot of folk now are coming out of the pandemic saying, I want a different rhythm. I want a different tempo. I want to come back to the world, but I want to come back more slowly.
Yeah, because I was actually going to ask that because obviously the pandemic has really thrown a spanner in the works in terms of both acceleration and deceleration. And I think there was a part where you mentioned, I think his name was Larry Dossey, right? The American physician, which is time is getting away, that there isn't enough of it, and you must pedal faster and faster to keep up. Now, do you think after the pandemic that the pandemic have helped with time sickness? And people would have completely slowed down, or will they go
I,
back to what they were?
I think it's going to be different for different people. I think some people are clearly itching to get back to the high stakes, high pressure, always on, constantly distracted, 24/7 stimulation. I mean, clearly some people are yearning to get back to that and are already getting back to it, and maybe didn't even leave it during the pandemic. But I think there's a pretty large, and I would guess growing chunk of the population that are coming, we're coming blinking into the light again after all these months of lockdown and confinement to the home and not being able to do things, right? Everything's been about doing more and more stuff before the pandemic. Suddenly you couldn't do anything or very little. And I think people come out of that thinking, I'm not sure if I want to go back to feeling like, well, what Larry Dossey described as time sickness, this feeling that there's never enough time. You're always rushing. You're always dashing to a finish line you never reach. And that's a pretty toxic and unhappy and unhealthy way to live. And I think we've had enough months of staring at ourselves in the mirror and stuck at home thinking about who we are and what kind of lives we want, that many of us will come out and say, no, I'm not gonna fall into that FOMO trap again. In fact, there was another one. People were talking about what was it they called it? JOMO, wasn't it? The joy of missing out was the thing that came out of the pandemic. That people were saying, it's actually relief that you don't have to go to three, 4 social events in the week, because there aren't any, right? And you didn't want to go to 4 before. Maybe you would have been happy going to 1 or 2, but you felt you had to go to 4. Suddenly the pandemic allowed you to go to none. So what does that mean when you go back? Well, you go back and think, maybe I'll this time only go to 1 or 2. And so I think we're going to see some tectonic shifts. We're already seeing them, people, the evidence is all around us in surveys and social media that many people have found this elongated moment of slowness and reflection has been a kind of pivot point. So because what slowness allows you to do is it allows you to stop, pause, see the big picture, understand and think about the life you're living or whether it's right for you. When you get stuck in fast forward, your head is down. The only thing you can see is the next item on your to-do list. And very often that means racing along a track that's the wrong track for you. You're living the wrong life for you. But because you don't take the time to stop and examine and ponder, you just keep going until you reach the cemetery or until you have a burnout or until something happens that forces you to stop and reassess. But I think the pandemic has kind of forced that on people. And that's why you're seeing across the board and around the world, people coming out of the pandemic, looking back at the life they had before and saying, that was the wrong life. I've had time now to stop, think, ruminate, and I'm going to come out and change. So you're seeing people coming out of relationships that maybe weren't working, but they were just sticking with because it was easier, changing careers or moving out of a city to a smaller town. All these big changes that kind of people probably needed to do, but didn't do because they were just stuck in roadrunner mode. I think this slow moment is going to be the key that opens that door for people.
I think I totally agree with you, especially with the Instagram community who always need to be showing something on their feed, which meant they were basically making themselves bankrupt, like going traveling and things like that, just so that they can have the pictures on their on their feed, which is ridiculous. So I think there are obviously lots of benefits. And actually, I think I came across a report recently by, I think, a full service sales and marketing agency for packaged goods in the US. I think it's from Acosta. And they said apparently 55% are eating at home more often since the pandemic began, which obviously it's a great start. And I was just wondering, do you think this will be the start of the slow food movement or the slow food habits? Like for everyone?
I think, well, I mean, I wouldn't say the start because it's, of course, slow food itself as a movement dates back to the late 80s and early 90s and has been on an upward curve since then. And I would argue before the pandemic that we had already moved in many ways in that direction as people, the explosion of artisanal production of everything from cheese to beer to bread. I think there's been a whole food revolution. A lot of that has been driven by a slow ethos before the pandemic. But yes, I completely agree that the pandemic has ratcheted that up because what did people do in the pandemic? Well, what could you do at home, right? You can only watch so much Netflix. So people did start cooking again or cooking more, and look at the sourdough bread boom, right? I mean, who would have imagined that pre-pandemic? And yet there it is. In fact, for my own life, my son, that was one thing that he's 22 years old. He hasn't bought a loaf of bread in more than a year.
Wow.
He bakes all his own bread from his own sourdough starter, right? I would never have done that as a 22. I mean, I'm a big foodie. I love food, but I've never have got there as a 22-year-old. And I would have probably not imagined he grew up in food has been a big part, and he learned to cook with me and at home and stuff. But wow, right? A 22-year-old lad baking all his own bread. That's a win for him, and I think for society. So I think that's a weather vane example, right? That's a marker of where the wind is blowing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it was also the banana bread craze at the beginning, and there was no flour left in the supermarket. So I was like, oh
exactly,
God. Yeah. And actually, I was wondering because, there's also, like, I'm not sure, like, for me, I've always thought I was time poor. And that's why I was wondering, do you think being time poor is a reflection on how you either waste time or spend time? Oh, Carl, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I do. I think there are two things in play here. One is that there are macro external forces acting on us when it comes to how we experience time. And there are also micro internal ones. So the macro ones that could make you feel like you're time poor are that you're stuck in a job or working under a boss who doesn't respect your time, right? You know, it just, so there, that's something external to you. And you may be in a position where you, in the short term, can't change that just for financial reasons, or you can change it and move to a different job, or you can rework things at the workplace. You know, that's the external. But I think what you're getting at is the internal one there, which is how we choose to use the time that we do have control over. And I think that's where a lot of us are falling down badly. I mean, if you look at time use studies, you know, just for the UK where we both live, right? I think the most recent ones suggest that the average British citizen now is spending, I think it's between, am I exaggerating? Something like 7 to 8 hours a day looking at a screen of some kind, you know, between social media, TV and stuff. And then we're all turning around and saying, I got no time, right? You know, and think of all those hours frittered away, doom scrolling through Instagram, or, you know, watching stuff on Netflix that you won't even remember 3 weeks from now. I mean, you know, nobody, put it this way, nobody lies on their deathbed and looks back and thinks, I wish I'd spent more time on Facebook, or more time watching Netflix. And yet, what is hoovering up most of our time these days? It's so often the gadgets that are all around us and that are designed to be addictive, right? Some of the cleverest brains in human psychology are being, you know, have been employed by Silicon Valley to turn these gadgets into crack cocaine. Yeah. So people find it really hard to switch off, to stop, but that means they create a time sink. It's like a black hole in your pocket, in the corner of the room, that just sucking time away from us. But that doesn't mean we can't step in, intervene, and stop that, right? I mean, there's an off button, right? It's again, that comes back to what I was saying at the start. It's the micro, it's the internal. It starts with us saying, no, you know, I'm not anti. I have Netflix, right? I have an iPhone, but they don't chew up the time in my day that they maybe did hitherto, or that I know they clearly do in other people's days. So it's sort of about how you use your technology, when you use it, and that kind of thing. I think that's a big part of how we get away from this time sickness problem.
Yeah, do you know what? I had to invest in an app blocker just to, you know, basically stop. And then I use my old phone now with no apps on it, just like a notepad, and like lock my other phone in the other room just so I can get away from it. And you realize how bad it is. It's like it's a proper addiction, and it's really quite scary how it can just draw you in like so easily.
It is. It's alarming. And they have done studies that show that people do respond as, you know, heroin addicts do. When you take away their fix, we respond similar ways when you take away our phone. You know, the kind of elevated heart rate, sweaty palms, anxious thought, all this sort of, it's all there, right? It is a kind of addiction. And I think like with any addiction, coming off it at first, especially cold turkey, is hard. And it's difficult, and there are withdrawal symptoms, right? All the classic things kick in, but you do get that, you break through that and you get out the other end. And I don't need to lock my phone up. I mean, personally, my use of, I have my phone with me physically much of the time, but my notifications are switched off permanently. There's no sound. It doesn't ever, so it never interrupts me. I choose when I want to look at my phone, I look at it, and then I choose to put it away, right? So I feel, for me, that works, and I don't feel in any way beholden to my phone, even though it's around me a lot physically.
Actually, and I think there's a big sort of correlation between, I think there was a poll that in the book where it says half of British adults said their hectic schedules had caused them to lose touch with friends. And obviously this pandemic has been a bit of a crazy mix in all of this. So do you think actually the pandemic has helped or hindered us keeping in touch with our friends, because a lot of us suddenly were like, oh, we need to make sure this is really important, these connections, we
Yeah.
need to kind of keep hold of them. So
I think it's hard to know exactly yet till someone does the full due diligence and the research on it. But I think the early studies suggest that it's a mixed picture. That on the downside, I think people, especially as the pandemic began to grind on, I think a lot of people turned inward, and some of those friendships fell by the wayside, and people just didn't have the energy or the bandwidth to keep them going, and it got tired of seeing people via Zoom. And I mean, I totally get that. I understand that, right? It was hard to maintain certain kinds of friendships through the pandemic. Others friendships, I think, clearly deepened, right? People found other ways to, whether it was meeting up outside, socially distanced, or yes, doing the Zoom thing, or speaking on the phone, literally like audio on the phone, which seems very old school, but is a nice way to stay in touch. People went back to speaking more on the phone, I think, than they did before, not just texting. So I think probably each person will find that if they look at their friend landscape, it was different. Each friendship was affected differently by the pandemic. But I do think that the one universal here is that the big lesson, I think, of the pandemic for everyone is that what pandemics do, what moments of crisis do, is that it focuses the mind on what really matters. And especially when you're able to slow down, and as we have been, to get, like I was saying earlier, you focus on who you are, what kind of life what you focus on, the important stuff. And I think what we've realized, that the really important stuff is being with other people. It is those relationships, it's friendships. It's not necessarily always just friendship in the classical sense. It can be, conversation with a neighbor, or just lingering in the local shop and talking to the shopkeeper or something, or, those sorts of things. And that's what everybody's been talking about, what they yearn to get back to. It. I mean, sure, we yearn to go see the theater and see a movie and go dancing and stuff. But I think really what it comes down to is we want to be around other human beings in a meaningful way. So I suspect that some of the friendships that maybe withered a little bit during the pandemic, hopefully we'll kind of get recharged again as we are able to, because it's clearly the yearning that we have and the need we have.
Definitely. And actually, that also brings me to, families and couples that are stuck at home together. And, do you feel like, how do you think people should slow down their relationships and have intimate moments when there's like less work-life balance now?
Well, I guess I would invert that and say you got to get more work-life balance. You got to, one way is to find ways to put work in its place. I mean, you're already starting to see pushback from employees against the incursion into more of their spare time at home. Companies are offering, who was it? Was it one of the big banks said they're going to have Zoom-free Fridays? And companies are more and more realizing that this is backfiring, pushing people too far, having no boundaries, and that people need boundaries, especially when they're at home. So I would say the first place to look is, if you feel your work-life balance is out of whack, start looking for ways to put your work-life balance into whack again, rather than trying to slow down tiptoeing around the fringes of a really bad, poisonous work-life balance. You can, even if there's nothing you can do on your work-life balance, there's always going to be little things you can do. You can, even if you just carve out 5 minutes here, or get up 5 minutes earlier in the morning, so your morning starts off a little less frantic, and you set the tone for the day a little more at a slower rhythm. There are little hacks here and there, but there's a big thing that has to change is your relationship to work. So especially in the pandemic, at home and stuff. So that's important too. But even alongside that, all the things, I mean, some of the things I said about the tech, try and, yes, you're on the phone with Zoom and stuff for work, but as soon as you're off work, try to set aside time when you're totally off social media as well. You don't go from work to social, you don't go from Zoom to Instagram, right?
Yeah.
Carve out moments where you say, okay, everyone in the house for the next hour, there are no screens on here. Maybe we hang out together, maybe we don't, but we're in a moment now where there is no distraction. There is no electronic interruption going on here. We just are slowing down to a human groove. So things like that. And it might not be an hour, it could be half an hour, whatever works for the person in question. But finding little moments, I think, is a key thing.
Yeah, I've got this giant printed pineapple bright yellow thing on top of all my screens, so I don't look at my desk at all after I finish work. I just
Oh,
throw this big like material over it, just so
yeah,
like some kind of divide
yeah,
between.
lovely. I mean, I salute you. I mean, and you're laughing, but it's very serious. That's serious science behind that. You know, that being in different spaces, the look of the scenery around you, that shapes how you feel, and how you move through that moment and so on. And yeah, so wherever possible, if you can keep work in a physically different space or just covered
Mm,
up. I mean, there's a great example from tech, which is that they found that when two people are in a conversation together and there's a mobile phone, a cell phone visible, and it doesn't have to ring or vibrate or illuminate or anything, right? It's just visible. Those two people keep the conversation at a more superficial level, right?
ah,
Just because part of each person's brain is thinking, there's an inbox there. What's happening? They're just not fully
yeah,
present. And that can be this, that's between two partners. It's between a boss and a client, a parent, a child, two friends. So a very simple win there is next time you're in a conversation one-on-one with someone, hide your phone, right? That's what pockets are
yeah,
for, or your it bag, or whatever it is. Just slip it out of sight, and right away with a very simple, instant gesture like that, you are going to improve the depth, texture, and richness of the conversation you're having with someone else. You're going to have a slower conversation, slower moment. So there's a little, fast tip for slowing down, right? A delicious paradox. Sometimes a little fast maneuver or pivot can deliver a huge slow payoff.
yeah. No, that's true. Actually, it's just these small kind of things you can do, isn't it? And it makes a big difference. And I was wondering, actually, what do you think the future of work will look like? Do you think we'll ever see a 4-day work week?
I I wonder. I mean, I kind of think, I hope that we do. I mean, we're certainly seeing more and more companies embracing it, and Spain actually very recently has announced a nationwide program, a kind of test pilot program with I think 250 or 300 companies.
Whoa.
So, I mean, again, the research is pretty solid that if you do it right, in
Hmm.
the right spirit, in the right industry, at the right moment, that a 4-day week can work. I'm always uneasy about rigid, one size fits all legislation that suddenly says everyone in this country must work 40 week.
Mm.
I shrink away from that in the same way as the
I saw the
35
French example.
hour work week in France.
Yeah.
It's just too dirigiste, strident. And I think that explains why it hasn't panned out the way its boosters hoped it would.
Mm.
But the principle of working less can mean working better and living better. I am totally and 100% on board with that. So
Yeah.
I think that in the whole arsenal of approaches and maybe even rules, possibly bits of legislation that we're going to deploy in order to get to a world where work is not all consuming and we have the right balance between work and everything else in our lives, I think the 4-day work week could be a useful part of that. Definitely.
Hmm.
Definitely. I mean,
That's
there's
true.
just one example as well from just before the pandemic was Microsoft in Japan ran a 4-day work week for a month, and
Oh,
productivity went up 40%. 40, I
whoa.
mean, 40% in a month off of 4-day work week. So, people who say 4-day work week is for slackers and losers and lazy people, phooey, right? On
Yeah.
the contrary, right?
Yeah, no, it's true actually. And actually, do you think we have to sacrifice wealth, or opportunities to live in a sort of a slower paced life?
I think I don't think, not automatically. I think some people I think many people will find that if they embrace this kind of slow mindset, and approach each moment with that notion of trying to be present and do things at the right speed and do one thing at a time and be intentional and all that kind of stuff that is slow. I think a lot of people embrace that. They would actually be more successful at work and make more money, right? So
Yeah.
that's part of the equation. I think there are clearly some people in the system as it's constituted at the moment who are just working crazy hours for insane, and I would argue probably obscene salaries, and slowing down. Some kind of shift there is going to have to occur for them to live a life worthy of the name.
Mm.
They're probably going to end up earning less money in some of those circumstances. So there's going to be people like that. It's not a one size fits all, but I don't think if it's certainly not a kind of everybody must work fewer hours, earn less money, and that's the only way to be slow. That is just not what slow is, right? Slow is something much broader, deeper, and bigger. And then once you've got the slow chip in your head, then you work out what it means in your own career and economic circumstances. And it's going to mean different things to different people at different stages of life.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, that's that's good to know, because I was a bit like, And I think one of the positives, the silver linings from the pandemic was obviously because people were traveling less, that, you know, pollution levels have gone down slightly. You know, there's been regrowth, animals returning to different areas, which I love.
Bicycle lanes popping up everywhere.
Bicycle lanes popping up. So I was just wondering, how do you think we can slow down our own consumption to preserve the planet?
Well, I think one of the benefits of living slow with a capital S is that you're more aware. You're more aware of what you're doing. You're more aware of what you're buying and consuming. You're therefore more aware of the knock-on effect of the choices you make every day when you buy things and so on. And I think it's just a natural corollary of slowing down, is that people begin to rethink and reassess their buying options, right?
Yeah. It's true. After this pandemic, do you feel like there's going to be another book in the making about slow? Because so much has changed as well. Do you think our culture would have shifted enough for you to actually consider another slow book?
I suspect that maybe that's as far as I can go. I mean, my books always take a long time. I'm not somebody who cranks one out every year. I'm more like every 4 or 5 years. And my books, I realize now, always start with a kind of personal existential crisis. So usually that's the spark. Something happens in my own life that makes me think, oh my God, you know, I need to unpack this and understand it. And then that usually leads on to, so I feel like I'm still in the pandemic, right? It's too soon for me to, I mean, I guess I am going through a personal existential crisis, like we all are with the pandemic, but I'm still going through it. So I haven't processed it. I haven't metabolized it yet. When I do, I suppose I'll probably have some sort of idea about whether there's a book to be written about it. But yeah, I'd love to. I mean, yeah, I can well imagine it, because my like you said at the beginning, my first 3 books are all about slow. Then my most recent book is actually about aging and ageism and stuff. So that was a new departure. But I could easily circle back to slow. In fact, during the pandemic, I did write a workbook. It was my pandemic baby. I'd been meaning to do it for years, but just never had the bandwidth or just the time or the energy to do it. And I did it. It's called 30 Days to Slow, and it's kind of helps people, you know. So that's new and out in the world, and it's quite exciting. And I'm doing boot camps for people and stuff. So that's been a new departure and something that's been a silver lining for me of the pandemics. But I don't consider that a book in the sort of book with a big B sense. It's a workbook. But yeah, good question. I think I would say watch this space would be my answer to your question about another slow book.
Awesome. I do feel like there's been going to be a cultural shift in this. So this is definitely some kind of opportunity there. And also, I'd obviously need to try out this workbook. So I will probably ask you about it afterwards as well, because that sounds awesome. And any final words for, you know, our listeners on how they should slow down?
Sure. I just say I always say that in a world addicted to speed, slowness is a superpower. So to keep that thought front of mind, because the world is constantly telling you that slow is stupid, slow is lazy, slow is boring, slow is unproductive, slow is unmodern, slow is roadkill. That's a myth. It's untrue. That actually by slowing down judiciously at the right moments, you are going to supercharge everything you do, from the way you eat to the way you make love, the way you raise your children, the way you work, the way you think. You're going to be the best version of yourself if you reconnect with your inner tortoise. So that would be my kind of 30,000 foot thought. A quick quote to end on is Mae West, the actress, said famously once, anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. So I think that's another useful thing to hang on to. And I guess just as a sort of general one, we've kind of thrown some tips around. I would just, one final tip would be to try and incorporate some kind of slow ritual into your day. And I think a lot of us probably done more of that over the pandemic. So that could be, I don't know, yoga or
Mm.
knitting. For me, it's often sketching,
Mm.
reading poetry, whatever it is, something that just here's a metaphor of the moment, it vaccinates you against the virus of hurry. You just need that little inoculation of slow. And so try and build that into your schedule every day. And I think that can be a kind of jumping off trampoline starting point for a bigger slow revolution in your life. And then just a final thing to throw in there, just a website, which is Carl Honoré, my name, carlhonoré.info. And that's where you can find everything about me that much more you'd ever want to know about books, audio, video, courses. It's all there. And then some.
Awesome. That's amazing, because I will definitely check that out myself. And also, yeah, I couldn't agree more. A bit of slow to boost our immune systems. So, yes.
Much
Thank you.
needed.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Carl. I really appreciate it.